Welcome to Two Truths, where we explore controversial topics in religion, philosophy, and history from at least two different perspectives. I'm Dr. Darren Yamarino, and today we're going to be doing the second part on our mysteries within Islam. So specifically, we're going to be looking at Surah 262 in the Qur'an, and it has some interesting implications. So let's start by reading it through. Here we go. Verily, those who believe, and those who are Jews and Christians and Sabians, whoever believes in Allah and the last day and do righteous good deeds, shall have their reward with their Lord, and there will be no fear for them, nor will they grieve. So there you have it. But the question for today, as you can tell from the title, is really about the Christianity piece. Who are the Al-Nasari that are mentioned as Christians here in this verse? Is it really Orthodox Christianity that most Christians would be familiar with? Or is it something quite different? Now, I want to just right out of the gate give you the answer, and then you'll need to stay through the whole video to understand why and get the details. The answer is that it's not Orthodox Christianity that's being referenced here, and most other places in the Quran, say in maybe like Meccan verses that seem positive or more pro-Christianity, that it is actually referring to Jewish Christianity, specifically a group known as the Ebionites, which there's a decent chance you've never heard of them. But it isn't just the Ebionites. There's sort of a couple of these other Jewish, Christian, and even like baptizing sects that are out throughout, the Eastern world and Saudi Arabia region by today's maps. So that's the main claim, all right? That actually it's not Orthodox forms of Christianity. So therefore, the true Christians of the Quran are not like Paul's version of Christianity or any form of Orthodox Christianity that develops. Instead, we're talking about Ebionism mixed with elements of Abyssinian Christianity, which would be like in Ethiopia. Those are the two main groups that are important to understand for what Christianity means within Islam and what type of Christianity influences Islam. So we could further ask, why does any of this matter? Who really cares about this in the 21st century? Well, I would say it matters a ton because there are huge disagreements between these religions, right? And there have been wars fought. And it's easy to read some lines, especially in English, and to get the impression that like, oh, what's really all the big deal here? Like, why are they fighting when they seem to be fellow people of the book and they share more things and they disagree on, stuff like that, right? But let's find out the truth of this. So let's look at the Quran, and I've got, 4 or 5 different surahs here that we can look at that will tell us a little bit about the viewpoint on both Jesus and Christianity that you find in the primary text, right, within Islam. So here we go. First quote. Certainly they disbelieve who say, surely Allah, he is the Messiah, son of Maryam. Now, all right, that quote right there is effectively denying the incarnation, right? Which is a central view within Orthodox Christianity, right? They're flat out saying that you can't equate, the Messiah or Jesus with being like God, right? So there you go. That's one initial quote that seems to be sort of anti-Orthodox, if you will. Now, let's keep going because there's plenty more here. Certainly they disbelieve who say, surely Allah, he is the third person of the three. And there is no God but the one God. And if they desist not from what they say, a painful chastisement shall befall those among them who disbelieve. All right. That's kind of obvious what that's about. But before I dive into it, let's get another quote that's directly related to this. The Messiah, Isa, son of Maryam, is only an apostle of Allah, and his word which he communicated to Maryam, and a spirit from him. Believe therefore in Allah and his apostles, and say not 3. Desist, it is better for you. Allah is only one God. Far be it from his glory that he should have a son. Okay, so 2 things in the last 2 quotes. Obviously, Muslims are anti-Trinitarian, right, in their viewpoint of God. They have a strict monotheism. So it should be noted that really Judaism and Islam share more, because there's also dietary, right, purity laws and things like this, where Christians, orthodox ones at least, are not going to have that. But in this case, we clearly have an anti-Trinitarian stance. I mean, it's really not up for debate. It couldn't be clearer when it says, say not 3, desist. So what's going on? Why are there some quotes that even seem to be more pro-Christian and then stuff in the Quran that seems to be anti-Christian or anti-Jewish even too? And the answer is pretty simple here, is that, on my view at least, Muhammad learns about Judaism and Christianity, what he thinks Christianity is, which I'm saying is this Abyssinian Christianity, or more likely this like Ebionism, this Jewish Christianity, that he learns about this stuff from these Hanifs, which are in my other video from our first mystery on Waraka, who I argue in that video might be the main central source for the Quran, or at least early aspects of it. If nothing else, a huge influence at least on Muhammad and his viewpoint of like what monotheistic religion should look like. So in his early days, these like more Meccan verses, he has a more positive, optimistic viewpoint on Judaism and Christianity because he's had minimal personal interactions. He has had some, there's accounts, but like minimal. And as time goes on and he encounters more Christians, but realistically a lot more like Jews than he does Christians, he comes to realize, like in Medina, that, maybe what I thought Judaism and Christianity is all about isn't really the dominant sort of form. And he sort of maybe sours on his viewpoint from this, especially because in Medina, there aren't a lot of Jews that convert to Islam. So those are just some like hypothesis as to why there might be this like disconnect, when you read through the Quran, like kind of more pro and then con viewpoint on these other people of the book, if you will. So let's look at some more though. Some more quotes from the Quran. Surely we have killed the Messiah, Isa, son of Maryam, the apostle of Allah, and they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it appeared to them so, and most surely those who differ therein are only in a doubt about it. They have no knowledge respecting it. Now, all right, this is a great line because it shows possible both Jewish, Christian, Ebionite, but also more like Gnostic, more specifically Gnostic viewpoints on the crucifixion. To be technical, this would be called a docetic view of the crucifixion, where within Islam, there's the belief that Jesus is effectively not crucified because God wouldn't allow such an important messenger or prophet to be humiliated in the ways that we do hear about, right? Jesus being humiliated in the Gospels. So this idea that somehow it was a mass hallucination event or there was a substitute stand-in for Jesus at the crucifixion. Both of those viewpoints are well established already in various Gnostic texts. Okay, so Islam coming about in late antiquity would probably have still had some access with these stories and texts. Okay, so let's get a little bit more, but we're almost finished looking at the Quran now before we move on to our next topic in this. Here we go. They have taken their doctors of law and their monks for lords besides Allah, and also the Messiah, son of Maryam. And they were enjoined that they should serve one God only. There is no God but He. Far from His glory be what they set up. Now, this quote sounds anti-orthodox and anti-church fathers, I would say, like the early church fathers. Desert fathers, monastics, Cappadocian fathers, whatever. Like all these people that are talking about the nature of Christ, like the Trinity. Is it a dual nature, single nature, and all this different stuff. And various saints, that it sounds like this quote is sort of against that whole thing and the Orthodox viewpoint, right, on Christianity. So let's take one last quote here from the Quran, all right? And then we'll move on to looking specifically at what is like Ebionism and other forms of Jewish Christianity in late antiquity. O you who believe, do not take the Jews and Christians for friends. They are friends of each other, and whoever amongst you takes them for a friend, then surely he is one of them. Surely Allah does not guide the unjust people. I mean, that seems like we've taken quite a turn, right, from the first verse that I read to you, where it's stating that those who believe, remember, and those who are Jews and Christians, that effectively they'll have their reward, right, with the Lord. This verse seems totally against that notion, right? So it kind of shows like these like very differing viewpoints that you do get, right? Now, let's look at what's going on here with this group called the Ebionites. Who are they, right? Before we get into some of like their specific views, I think briefly it'll help to understand this, that Jesus dies, right? After he dies, you have almost pretty early on, there's going to be a split. There's going to be a Jewish Christian stronghold in Jerusalem, okay? Led by James, right? His brother, right? So James is going to have sort of this stronghold of Christians who are still Jewish, like practicing even Jewish customs, and even have decent relationships with like the Pharisees and people like this, which might surprise you, in the first century. But then we've got Paul, who, let's not forget, wasn't there, was not part of the original group of 12 or 70 or however many, right, at various points in time during Jesus' mission. So Paul comes in, and being this apostle to the Gentiles, takes this message out to everyone else who's non-Jewish and poses all these questions in his letters to his various, churches that he's founding throughout the Mediterranean world. He's basically saying like, look, you don't have to become Jewish first in order to become Christian, right? Like Jesus has effectively brought in a New Testament, right? He's altered things. So that's going to be at odds with what sort of James is sort of talking about and suggesting. Now, what then occurs is that the Romans, right, crush any sort of resistance movements around the year 70 CE. in the first century, and they destroy the Second Temple and all that. And basically any of the sort of like early church leaders that were more Jewish Christian kind of get dispersed out into neighboring towns, and they're no longer in the positions of authority. And that only further helps to solidify Paul's sort of brand, if you will, of Christianity, right? So all of that is critical to note. That sort of leads us to like the orthodox view of Christianity. Whereas this sort of like James group, they still exist, and they kind of go more east and also south down into Ethiopia, where this Abyssinian Christianity is. So like Oriental Orthodox Church, as it sometimes might be called. So the Jewish Christian beliefs go more like east and south, which makes sense that it's going to come in contact with eventually, when we get to Muhammad and Waraka and these Hanifs, that they would have contact more with like this form of Christianity as opposed to, say, a Catholic, right, form, Orthodox Christian form that has developed in more of like Turkey, Greece, Italy, right? And kind of other parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. Right? So that's a little setup, okay? Now, these groups do exist, as I said. They just sort of smaller and dispersed and broken up, and one of them is this like Ebionite group, which the term comes from the word meaning like poor, effectively, like poor people. It is used like in the Sermon on the Mount, but not referencing these people as a group, just the term referencing like poor people, like humble people, which if you recall is Sermon on the Mount, like blessed are sort of the poor, right? People that are at the bottom are going to be raised up type of thing. So we learn about this group though from the church fathers and heresy hunters, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of them. Irenaeus is an early one, right? So they kind of feed off one another, these different heresy hunters, and they work with each other's earlier material. So what we're going to learn is this, that the Ebionites are Jewish Christians. They have a low Christology, okay? So that means that their viewpoint on the nature of Jesus is that he's effectively a man. He's just a super righteous man. He's not a God fully or something like that. Okay. So that's a low Christology. They use a version of the Gospel of Matthew, which makes sense because the Gospel of Matthew is the most Jewish of all of the four Gospels. Okay. And this particular version that they have is in Hebrew. And sometimes it's referred to that they have something called the Gospel of the Hebrews, given that it's written in Hebrew, but it's, effectively some sort of either like harmonized gospel of different accounts, but mainly the Gospel of Matthew. Okay. They've also are known for having like a bunch of other sort of texts. So, for example, it's a Jewish Christian belief that's found in the Travels of St. Peter, in the Clementine homilies, that there's a primeval religion transmitted from Adam to Abraham to Moses, right? But after Moses, the religion is distorted. So here we have sort of this additional evidence of what's going to be known as this Din Ibrahim that Muhammad's going to be trying to restore. This idea that there was a religion of Abraham that gets, distorted along the way. And this is something that Muhammad and early Muslims are going to latch on to. Possibly even Waraka was familiar with all this and why he was trying to build up and push Muhammad as a prophet. But since we're limited on time, it's going to hit you with like a numerical list, okay? So you can get an overview of sort of like Ebionite beliefs, but also this list effectively share with the Qur'an. So striking similarities between the two. Number one, both share a strong passion for the Hebrew Bible, especially Mosaic law, right? It's definitely more like Jewish than it would be orthodox Christian. Both have a low Christology, number 2, believing Jesus is a man, but also that he is the Messiah. See, but they don't have the much stronger high Christology that you find in orthodox Christianity. 3, this one's interesting. Both have frequent ritual ablutions of like immersion in water, whether it's washing, your hands and forearms and feet or something in Islam, or you're talking about full water immersions. It's a daily for some of these like baptizing groups that are related to Jewish Christianity. That was a common practice, that it could be as often as even daily. And that is not something you find typically in Orthodox Christianity, right? Having to do that as a repeated situation or all the time, right? So that was number 3. Number 4, both seek to stop, right, the cultic practices of the old ways by abolishing sacrifice. Right? So that's sort of a distinction from like other forms of earlier Judaism that might have been around. 5, both believe in a primeval religion transmitted from Adam to Abraham to Moses, and then it gets distorted after that, and they need to try to like fix it. 6, both believe circumcision to be terribly important. 7, both share an apparent anti-Pauline, like Paul's form of Christianity, stance. It should be noted, in the Qur'an, Jesus is mentioned 93 times, I believe. Mary's mentioned, John the Baptist, I believe, is mentioned multiple times, and all this. Important figures are mentioned. But who is not mentioned at all? Peter or Paul, they're not mentioned. You've got to ask yourself, like, how are they not getting a single mention in this? If really what we're talking about is Orthodox Christianity. It's because we're not. Right? That's my claim. So that was number 7, that they have the anti-Paul sort of stance. In fact, the Ebionites think that he's like kind of a traitor even, an apostate. So they're well aware of him. Maybe the Quran doesn't mention it, but the Ebionites are definitely anti-Paul. Okay. Number 8, both are open to a possibly docetic understanding of the crucifixion, which I already mentioned. This is fairly commonplace in Gnostic forms of Christianity or some of these Jewish Christian forms, that either the crucifixion didn't happen the way you think it did, it was a hallucination, or just was a substitute that was put on the cross for Jesus or something. Right? Lastly here, number 9, in the Quran, you have this the Qibla, which is this, like, where you pray, the direction of prayer, and everyone assumes that's to Mecca, which it is today, but originally it was not. It was to Jerusalem, right? So originally, the Quran is revering Jerusalem. So do the Ebionites, because they trace back their sort of Jewish Christianity, right, back into Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is going to also be a very important situation within Islam, because that is where Muhammad has his sort of famous midnight ascent, which transitions us sort of into our last topic with this, which is, okay, I'm claiming that, remember, Surah 262, where they talk about al-Nasari, that the Christians being referenced are Jewish Christians. But also, they're referencing Abyssinian Christians, who are also very Jewish in their form of Christianity. They're kind of like the other group that's around still at Muhammad's time that are strongly Jewish, okay? So the couple things to say about Abyssinian Christianity. Just sort of, this is sort of a random piece, but just to start with this, we have a fascinating account in Ibn Hisham, his biography of Muhammad, that was heavily used in my prior video, where Abyssinian Christians come up when Muhammad's foster mother has to deal with him. And here's what it says. Very odd. Quote, a number of Abyssinian Christians saw him, Muhammad, with her when she brought him back, okay, after he had been weaned. They looked at him, asked questions about him, and studied him carefully. Then they said to her, let us take this boy and bring him to our king in our country, for he will have a great future. We know all about him. The person who told me this alleged that she could hardly get him away from them. Fascinating account. We basically are hearing that like these Abyssinian Christians already know who Muhammad is. Why? He's a kid. The obvious answer, if there is one at all, is that Waraka, who's always involved in Muhammad's biography, is himself either an Abyssinian Christian, he is a Christian, or he's definitely friends with them and acquainted with them and has probably told them about this guy. That's the only thing that makes any sense as to how they know him. And they're basically trying to like abduct him, is what it sounds like. So kind of weird, right? So that's just sort of one little side note that's of interest. But what about their belief system? So here we go. A couple things. Abyssinian Christians have different texts that they take as canonical compared to, say, Catholics, right? For example, they take the Ascension of Isaiah and 2nd and 3rd Enoch, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Enoch, all of these as canonical. Now, if you read 2nd, 3rd Enoch, and especially Ascension of Isaiah, these are straight up mystical ascent texts. And they sound identical, almost very similar to the account we have of Muhammad's midnight ascent. Like, it's almost impossible to accept that there's not some form of, sharing of ideas here. There are some weird stories, like supposedly Muhammad witnesses some Jewish boy in Medina who claims to be a prophet of God doing like some sort of ascent ritual practice as well. But, who knows on that? I should also point out that I think it's in Surah 1956 through 57, I think, where basically Enoch is mentioned in the Quran. So like Enoch is well known as well within the Quran, which could show this Abyssinian Christian influence. Another key thing that the Abyssinian Christians do, they rest. They don't do work on the Sabbath. That's very Jewish, right? And then last but not least, the first hijrah, right? This sort of like escape into safety that you have is from Mecca to Abyssinia, to Aksum, to Ethiopia, to the king there. So we have this account that, I'll read it to you. Right? When the apostles saw the affliction of his companions, these are like the earliest converts, okay, to Islam. He said to them, if you were to go to Abyssinia, it would be better for you, for the king will not tolerate injustice, and it is a friendly country, until such time as Allah shall relieve you from your distress. So thereupon his companions, it says, went to Abyssinia. Now some come back, and then they go back again, I believe, with more converts to Abyssinia. Why? Why would you send them there unless you obviously know that they're going to accept our belief system? Like what we're trying to talk about as monotheism is clearly going to resonate or mesh with them enough. So there you've got it. That is why I got more than that, by the way, but I'm keeping the video at 30 minutes. There's a lot of material as to bring supporting evidence that when Muslims at least early days and in the Quran, when they're talking about Christians, they're not talking about orthodox Christians, okay? So they're talking about Jewish Christianity. Now, there's a totally different question, which is, who are the Sabians that were mentioned in that verse that I said, 262? If you're interested in the comments, I can make a whole nother video on that. I've got all the material on that as well. I mean, my short answer is that it's a collection of a variety of remaining Gnostic views, not one specific form or Gnostic group. So that could be for another time. But basically, Ebionites, Abyssinian Christians, and a group I didn't mention called like Elkazites, which are like baptizing sect and stuff. Like, these are sort of the three that seem to have relevance when talking about Al-Nasari and Christians, right? I should have actually pointed out that Al-Nasari, that term, Nasari, like Nazareans, very similar. And the Ebionites are split in two, where there's a more hardcore and a less hardcore group, and the less hardcore group are known as Nazareans. I mean, that's how they're referred to in the text and by like the Christian heresy hunters and stuff. So, I mean, there's an overwhelming amount of evidence. I only went through some of it. Again, please comment, and I'm happy to have you try and shred all of this. I'm not trying to say anything negative about the religion at all, just like I wasn't when I made a similar video on Christianity, just like I wasn't when I made a video about like Judaism, where I talked about the influence of Jethro, remember? And I talked about the influence of John the Baptist on Christianity. So I think it's critical that people understand the origins of their own, faith. Their religion is often shrouded in murky origins. All of them are. Every single religion. So that's not to say anything negative about any of them. It's just that we have to be willing to answer these questions and look at these early sources. So there you have it. Thank you for listening a little bit longer than some of my more recent videos. But since we don't have definitive information, right? We do have some good evidence, but not definitive information. It's always good to stay gray.